Hi friends, welcome to episode 20 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own, or when appropriate, I cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I went to my very first edcamp yesterday. Technically, I've attended an edcamp years ago, but it never took off. Back then, the coordinator of this, quote, unconference, end quote, tried to explain the rather organic way in which topics populate the offering board. It felt awkward, like attending a middle school dance. There were brave souls who knew exactly what to expect, and then everybody else had no idea. Well, yesterday was a different story. I went to Schoolcraft College, located in Livonia, a suburb in the Metro Detroit area, for their 5th annual edcamp. What made this day especially fun was the setting. We were treated to conference-style rooms used for college courses and corporate training, with oversized tables and swivel office chairs with ergonomic design. Nearly all of my PD during the school year typically takes place in school computer labs and in classrooms, and sometimes sitting at tables and chairs which are intended for very small children. There were some attendees who clearly came prepared to give presentations, several who were practicing and revising presentations which were going to be given at the McCall Conference in March, which is Michigan's largest EdTech conference. I've included a link to the schedule matrix in the show notes. What I found freeing is that the format invited a more informal and interactive vibe where the presenter fielded input from the participants in the room. I gathered up some courage, and I wrote my offering on one of the blank boxes on the dry erase board during the 4th and final session. Because I wasn't taking up the last available spot, I decided I'd give it a go. I offered a deep dive into Google Keep and ended up having a very nice balance of Google Keep rookies who seemed appreciative and veterans who tossed out their own suggestions and tips. I did have time to demonstrate optical character recognition feature and voice memos as well. And as with all conferences, I learned a lot about many different resources and I networked all day long. Having attended and being part of a planning of a much more formal conference where the course offerings are planned ahead of time and there were keynote speakers along with registration fees and hotel expenses and significant parking costs, the EdCamp, which was hosted on a Saturday at a local community college, was a refreshing change. In both cases, I connected with and learned a great deal from fellow educators. The difference was I didn't have to submit a request to my administration for sub-coverage, reimbursement for registration fees, or write lesson plans to leave when I missed work. With EdCamps now part of my PLN, I'll be keeping an eye out for more offerings in the coming months. I mentioned in last week's episode my favorite Super Bowl commercial by Xerox and the Monks. This year's Super Bowl, surprisingly, had a commercial, or more accurately, mini commercials, with a library connection, which my daughter mentioned to me earlier this week when she called. These commercials are really just 15-second teasers of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is being made into a movie and scheduled to be released in August. And according to Vox, the screenplay is staying very close to the original stories. I've also included a link to a YouTuber's take on these early teasers in the show notes. Jimmy Champane clearly was a fan of these books, and I've never read them. The movie isn't rated yet, so I won't be showing the trailer to my students. I have in the past shown movie trailers to promote books. I might put the movie poster up on my smartboard and mention it to my upper elementary students. Not that these books need any promoting in my libraries. Copies of these books and ones similar to them have been very popular, and remarkably, my students seem to overlook the really tired condition of this collection. True, the cover art is enough to shock their classmates, and this trilogy was published in 1981, 1984, and 1991 by the author Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by Caldecott winner Stephen Gammell. I should have suspected, but several of the Schwartz books were on the list of challenged and banned books across the country when they were initially published. Surprisingly, I haven't had any parent pushback. I often get the question from my students, "Where are your scary books?" And while I haven't recorded an episode on genreification, I did cave last spring, and I created a shelf of horror in my library. Many of these books had rather an ancient spine label of like a ghost on them, and they were scattered throughout my collection. It made complete sense because I could now direct my students to one bookshelf rather than have to explain why the collection of scary stories was in 398.2. The Goosebumps books and American Chillers were in fiction, and the Choose Your Own Nightmares were scattered throughout the paperback collection. I do make it a point, especially with my younger students, to have that preliminary conversation along the lines of, these stories might be frightening. You might even have a nightmare. I ask them, do you think your parents are okay with you bringing this book home? I always tell them, you can switch if you change your mind. Why don't you take a look at it? And then finally I do say, if your parents email me, can I tell them that you and I have had this talk? I even label the shelf with, Beware of Nightmares, using an oversized, spooky font. As I record an episode, I do my best to thank everyone that I've mentioned, and I try to send them a link to the episode. And it's amusing to hear from other podcasters who learned about podcasts by listening to last week's episode. In response to several suggestions I got on Twitter, I did go and add the entire list of podcasts I use for my job, recognizing that this list will never be complete or comprehensive. And I made sure to include them by category, so I hope that helps. I did also make the decision not to include podcasts that I listen to for news and information and entertainment. And while it should be obvious, it is worth mentioning that if you listen to enough podcasts, from time to time, you will hear something on an episode which just happens to relate to work. Of course, that very thing happened to me this week, on Tuesday, in fact. If you work in a middle school or high school library, this week there was much anticipation of the follow-up to the massively successful book and movie, The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. Her second novel, On the Come Up, was released this week. I was listening to Sam Sanders on NPR's It's Been a Minute on Tuesday morning. His Tuesday program always features his long-form interview, as opposed to Friday's weekly wrap-up. I never miss an episode, and I must have had the dumbest look on my face as I listened bright and early while I was walking my dogs on Tuesday morning. He was interviewing Angie Thomas. I've included a link to the podcast in my show notes. And to reinforce my message of the value of podcasts, the format, the New York Times posted an interview with Angie Thomas on January 31st, promoting the release of her new novel. I'll attach a link in the show notes. Don't get me wrong, I love the New York Times, and I've been a devoted reader for years. However, given the choice of listening to the author, her voice, her rapping, her personality in my ears, and engaging in a conversation with Sam Sanders, who, second only to Terry Gross and Fresh Air, left a far more lasting impression than reading the words on the screen. I might as well have been sitting in the recording studio with them because of the kind of intimacy which podcasts can afford. I was enraptured. So I guess my point is this. In addition to listening to podcasts that'll help us do our job, find podcasts which round out those other needs of information, news, curiosity, entertainment, and don't be surprised if every once in a while, by luck or happy coincidence, you hear something you can use for your library, your teaching, your everyday. You'll find, as I have, that including a variety of podcasts in your daily routines, that maybe your perspective is broadened just a little or your attitude is more nuanced, perhaps your ability to share in random conversations, or your familiarity with the day's events, the fact that you can just answer more questions correctly on Jeopardy, and yes, be better at your job is the reward. And now, today's discussion on self-published books. Work in any library long enough, and I am sure you have been approached by someone carrying a copy of a book they have self-published. On more than one occasion, students have told me that their mom or dad was writing a book for kids. Because my students are very young, I don't usually follow up with any questions. Typically a, "Wow, that sounds really cool," has always sufficed. And in several of my schools, the Assembly Committee schedules a guest author to come and visit during March's Reading Month. Because the librarians cover so many buildings, 4 to 6 on average this year, we typically aren't assigned to building committees, as we aren't necessarily around when the committees meet. Now, some would argue that this is a distinct bonus to being a traveling teacher. What I can say is this. When I do find out who the visiting author is, I don't have any idea who this person is. I've never heard of their book, nor of our students. Not surprising, if the library is given a copy of their book, we have to create a completely new record for it, as one doesn't exist in our available databases, because the book is self-published. Creating a MARC record in my software is so convoluted that what I've done is I've simply slapped on a label that reads, "Library copy. Please enjoy this book in the library." And I put it with the non-circulating books, such as Guinness Book of World Records, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and Where's Waldo? About 4 years ago, the guest author actually was one of our art teachers in the district. She had teamed up with another teacher to illustrate a book. Before I decided to look into this phenomenon of self-publishing, I knew very little. As I hinted earlier, episodes about celebrity authors, there are a large number of people who have decided that creating a children's book is not hard. The whimsical, "I've always thought of writing or illustrating a book for children," is something that I hear a lot at gatherings, especially when I mention what I do for a living. And why not? This is my soapbox, by the way. Thanks to the internet, most flights of fancy can be entertained in some way or another. At the risk of offending anyone, I'm going to apologize now, because if you're an aspiring author or illustrator listening to this episode, I have some rather strong opinions. Consider this. Anyone who's ever wanted to own a store or sell something like crafts can bypass the inconvenience of having a brick-and-mortar store, or even ever having to leave the house to go to a craft show, thanks to Etsy. So why not follow your dream and create a book for children? Who needs a book deal? Why bother with dealing with the repeated rejection of having to please an editor or compromise your vision in any way? If you have money, you can circumvent all these unpleasantries. And I've never heard of the term vanity presses before I did this deep dive, but I've seen it in action, and I hate to say it. It often looks like amateur hour for wannabe authors and aspiring artists. And the internet is more than happy to accommodate those with money, and dare I say, individuals who desperately need a hobby, to see writing a children's book as their moral imperative. I think that there is a sense of entitlement because, as with social media, we all have our voice. Why let the bothersome, judgmental publishers of the printing house get in the way of your dream to write a children's book? But I think about the now famous authors who were famously rejected. Steve Hendricks wrote in the Washington Post on March 10th, 2018, the article titled, "Publishers Hated a Wrinkle in Time, Madeleine Engel Never Forgot Rejections." I'll include a link in the show notes. Apparently, her literary agent fielded all 26 rejections from the publishers, and while most of those were destroyed, some of those rejections were preserved. Miss Lengel wrote, quote, "Each rejection, no matter how philosophically expected, is a wound," end quote. She wasn't alone. Among those whose genius wasn't embraced immediately by publishers, C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, Kipling's The Jungle Book, 5 publishers rejected Anne of Green Gables. Reportedly, Seuss's To Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street wasn't picked up until the 28th publishing company reviewed it, and perhaps most remarkably, the 12 rejections for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I wonder if these authors had been looking for a publisher for their first book today, would they have decided earlier in this rejection process just to self-publish? That is precisely what Beatrix Potter did in The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Not today, but someday I'm going to follow Peter down the internet rabbit hole to find out just how many of the Beatrix Potter books were self-published before somebody finally took notice. There are some noteworthy books which were initially self-published before becoming hugely successful, and I feel safe in saying that these are probably an exception and not the rule. Brianne Alphonse posted an article on electricliterature.com on August 2nd, 2018. There's a link in the notes. Titled, Sick of the Query and Rejection Grind? Check out these wildly successful authors who took matters into their own hands. She included the stories of 11 self-published authors. I won't go into the description of all 11, but they included E. E. Cummings' poetry, Andy Weir's The Martian, E.L. James' 50 Shades of Grey, Margaret Atwood's book of poetry titled Double Persephone, William P. Young, who printed 15 copies of The Shack to give to his family members for Christmas, and Christopher Paolini, who, at the age of 18, self-published Aragon and holds the world record for the youngest author of a best-selling book series, with more than 20 million copies sold. On April 11th, 2018, Joanna Penn wrote a very detailed explanation of the pros and cons of traditional publishing versus self-publishing for thecreativepenn.com. I'll include a link in the show notes. Along those same lines, Alisha Krpalani posted Traditional versus Self-Publishing, and the winner is, on the website writingcooperative.com on January 24th, 2018. Again, links in the show notes. I'd like to list the benefits of both, with the obvious being that one's pros are the other one's cons. When authors go the traditional route of publishing, the benefits include prestige, public perception, working with a professional team, and that includes editors, formatters, marketing, and promotion, turning out a, quote, polished final product, end quote, and having the established destinations of distribution such as bookstores and libraries. There are virtually no personal upfront costs, and your consideration for literary prizes, media coverage, and you become known faster in the reading circles. The advantages to self-publishing, however, include the complete control you retain, the speed with which your finished book is printed and on the market, and the fact that you will retain higher royalty rates because you have very little overhead, and you aren't restricted by contracts. I did come across a fascinating post by Art Kavanagh on April 8, 2018, on medium.com titled, Why I'm No Longer a Self-Published Author. He wrote of the cruel irony, quote, Of course there are self-published authors who have been and continue to be enviably successful. They are a tiny, proportionally infinitesimal minority. Their best-selling book is one which explains to the other would-be self-publishers how they did it. In fact, some observers believe that more money is made from self-publishers selling them how-to books, and courses and services, editing, design, and marketing, than by self-publishers, end quote. I then came across a plethora of articles on how to get your self-published book into libraries. One which stands out, because I believe it exemplifies exactly the point made by Art Kavanagh, is one by Amy Collins. She wrote a rose-colored glasses depiction of the current state of public libraries in her article titled 5 Reasons Why Selling to Libraries Needs to be a Top Priority. for the blog Reedsy, REEDSY.com, a link in the show notes, on February 21st, 2017. She describes how public libraries are experiencing increases in their budget. Really? Our local libraries spent an incredible amount of time and effort passing a millage to support their initiatives because their budget isn't adequate, and they heavily rely on the support of outside funding from friends of the library, as well as beneficiaries of generous estate planning from the community. Furthermore, Ms. Collins would have readers to believe that literary fame can be easily achieved in a few simple steps. A questionable statistic said that librarians who responded to the survey cited in the article, 92% of them reported in 2016 that they regularly purchase books from small presses and self-published authors. Among the materials Ms. Collins suggests her readers to prepare is a, quote, one-page sheet about the author that showcases what a great person you are, end quote. I, for one, have been authorized to purchase books for libraries for 13 years now and have never based this decision on what a great person the author was. I did appreciate the interview that librarian Marlene Harris gave to Lindsay Buricker in February 2012's to getting your self-published book into the library, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Her suggestions include, first of all, avoid spiral or comb bindings, which public libraries avoid incorporating into their collections. And I'll pursue this in a formatting bias episode I have planned in the future. And also avoiding anything which may make your book look dated or have content which becomes easily dated quickly. She also recommends connecting with the person in charge of acquisitions or the youth services if you have a children's book. And while it should be woefully obvious, she suggests that you meet the person in charge of purchasing in person. She suggests donating 2 copies because the labor involved with processing books makes a great deal of sense to include 2 in the gift. Marlene Harris also suggested that you try to get included in the library program which promotes an author reading or a book signing. And ideally, a community library promotes local authors in their newsletters and their reviews, which brings up something really critical. Self-published authors need to get reviews, and they need those to get noticed. Librarians depend heavily on reviews to make purchasing decisions. And this is a little-known fact. You can pay Kirkus to review your book. Apparently, it isn't cheap, and it doesn't guarantee that the review will be a positive one. You should also consider having an ebook as well as an audiobook format available. And while it won't take up space on the shelf and you won't make any money while you do this, it will help you build a following. And there's something also that should have occurred to me at the beginning of this conversation is why there is such a push for self-published authors to get their books into libraries. Simply put, bookstores are disappearing. Your options for distribution are getting smaller. Finally, a perspective which is a refreshing one comes from Andrea Jamison, writing on the ALA's Intellectual Freedom blog titled, Where Do We Stand? Libraries and Self-Published Authors, on May 2nd, 2018. She acknowledges that, quote, libraries have begun using self-publishing as a way to reconnect with communities by offering workshops and resources geared towards independent authors. Although this commitment is commendable, it still begs the question as to whether or not libraries are doing enough. She continues, it is not uncommon for writers to choose this route of self-publishing because the traditional publishing route is difficult, if not impossible, for some writers to enter. This is especially true if you happen to be a member of a marginalized group. Self-publishing is probably the only opportunity available to you. And lastly, she concludes, if we truly want to connect with the community, we have to think of our patrons as more than just receivers of content, but the creators of that content as well. End quote. I had neglected to consider that the self-publishing could promote diversity in our collection and ensure that our collections reflect not just our community of readers, but represent the contributions of our community of authors as well. I don't know the extent to which I have changed my mind about self-published books, but I definitely have a greater appreciation for the process and why these books deserve our consideration. I would like to thank you for listening today. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. Share this podcast with other school librarians in your district and your PLN. Consider leaving a rating as it helps other school librarians learn about this podcast. I would like to thank net composer Nazar Ryback at hooksounds.com for the music you've heard today. And as always, I invite your feedback and contributions. Please email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. The topic of our next episode will be Genius Hour. I hope you will tune in.